Hello, AP HuG students. This is Mrs. Truex, and Mr. Beilstein and I want to give you all a little bit of a crash course on the development of our world from the beginning of time until current day. As we begin to start or transition, I should say, into our next unit, population and migration, we need to spend a little bit of time going over the development of our world. Population is so fascinating to study because when you really think about it, from the beginning of time until about 1750, there was modest population growth. We're talking about 700 million people in 1750, which, considering the dawn of time until today, we've seen some massive population growth. Our population currently stands at about 7 billion. And so, in order to really understand how this growth happened sort of exponentially from 1750 until now, we need to talk a little bit about development. Our objectives for this PowerPoint are pretty simple. We want to trace the development of the globalized modern world, including the significance of both agricultural revolutions and the Industrial Revolution, and also to dive a little deeper into the role of globalization. Globalization is pretty significant as we move forward, and you'll see why as we move through the PowerPoint. Sounds a little odd to say in the beginning, but really in the beginning, people were, or population was rather small because people were organized into nomadic tribes of hunter-gatherer societies. And as a result of that, and because of how difficult life was, population remained relatively low until the first agricultural revolution or the Neolithic revolution. What marks this as the first agricultural revolution was really the domestication of animals and crops. Suddenly, people are moving from hunter-gatherer societies into farming societies. People are building more stable homes, establishing villages, societies are becoming more complex, and as a result, more people equal more food. The next couple of slides just show the agricultural hearths and diffusion of both the old world and the new world. Make sure to pay attention to the arrows which show the direction of spread. We are going to spend a great deal of time talking about the spread of agriculture when we get to that unit. So this is just a preview. This is also just kind of continuing with New World diffusion. So this is also just a preview for your enjoyment. I already mentioned that when people settled down and started farming, society became more complex, and cities were just one of the developments that happened as a result of people not migrating anymore. After the establishment of cities came trade and labor specialization and the need for transportation and communication infrastructure. So you see sort of the early modern cities beginning to develop and major trade routes taking hold. And as trade becomes part of society, embedded within societal norms, came the need for maps and directions and how to get from point A to point B. So you might see a little bit of full circle from Unit 1 coming up right here. Cities grow into empires and states. An empire building leads to European conflict, conquest, and colonization in the name of the three G's: gold, God, and glory. I want to spend a little time talking about this slide because I think it's really important and it's relevant. It's going to come up again as we move through the rest of the school year. This model is based on a concept called world systems theory, developed around, I don't know, like late 15th century. And it's the idea that Immanuel Wallerstein came up with that explains the emergence of a core, periphery, and semi-periphery in terms of economic and political connections. And so I wanted to talk to you about what each one of those means. When we're talking about the core, we're talking about national or global regions where economic power in terms of wealth, innovation, and advanced technology is centered or concentrated. And if you look at this map here in 1800, it's all about Europe. And that should make sense because at that time Europe was sort of dominating the rest of the world. Um, in sort of the purplish area, you have the semi-periphery, or newly industrialized, or in this map, pseudo-industrialized countries with a medium standard of living. Semi-periphery countries offer citizens relatively diverse economic opportunities, but have pretty extreme gaps between the rich and the poor. And that's not as relevant for this particular map, but I'm going to show you a couple of other maps about how the world's systems are changing over time. Peripheral countries, or countries in the periphery, have the weakest structural and economic position in the world, and so those are the countries that are pretty uh, not doing so well. And then you have these external areas, which during this time period are areas that were of little consequence to the core regions of the world, probably to the semi-periphery as well. The next agricultural revolution that spurred development was the second agricultural revolution, which was probably responsible in part for making the industrial revolution what it was, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But the second agricultural revolution saw improved farming technology, which resulted in fewer farmers needing to grow food. So more food was produced by fewer people. Also, improved fertilizer made growing food a little bit easier. Improved food storage as well meant that you could grow more food and then save the food to feed more people. And really, that's the key, is this idea that the second agricultural revolution, like the first one, allowed for the feeding of even more people. Sort of the negative part of this was that because fewer farmers were needed, more farmers had to give up their farms, which were often bought up by larger farmers, and then move to the cities. And so as a result of this, you have sort of this connection between the Industrial Revolution, which was looking for more workers to work in industries in the cities, and the Second Agricultural Revolution, which made farming more efficient. And this sort of combination between this agricultural revolution and people needing to find work in other places drove the Industrial Revolution in England, which happened around 1760. Here you see images of the Industrial Revolution both in Europe and then in the bottom right-hand corner in the United States. In the United States, the Industrial Revolution took about a century. It started in the late 1700s, 1790s through the 1830s was probably the initial or the first phase of the Industrial Revolution here, and then not to the turn of the next century do we sort of complete the process. And returning again to our core semi-periphery periphery map, you see how things have shifted and have changed in terms of what is the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery. Now, a huge part of North America is sort of part of that core group of countries that have the most economic and political power. As countries became more industrialized, industrialization fueled further European conquest, especially as it relates to some of those areas that were of little significant economic consequence, as we saw in the maps earlier. Particularly, this is true for Africa and the European conquest or carving up of Africa. Many issues that the African continent faces today can be traced back to the European conquest post-industrial revolution. Probably one of the biggest issues is that not every nation industrialized, especially those in Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And Africa is an interesting case study because, they were purposefully forced to not industrialize because it didn't suit the needs of the Europeans who took control of the region. And as a result of this, you can look at Latin America and Asia sort of it's the same way, but as a result of this, you see countries developing at different rates. And so when we look at countries' development and we ask those questions like, why are some nations rich? Why are some nations poor? A lot of it has to do with the global connections created earlier on. And we're going to talk about some of those in more detail as we move through subsequent units. Just like we saw earlier in this presentation, trade becomes more and more important. The industrialized world is set on a path towards globalization, or a new world system consisting of the industrialized developed world and the agricultural developing world. Um, and I'm going to be as unbiased as I can, and share with you some of the pros and cons of globalization. But it really is interesting to look at how industrialized nations developed with regards to their economies, and some of these less industrialized or less developed LDC countries, as it relates to their economies, and how we see sort of an interconnectedness of the world. In the bottom right hand corner, you see a pair of jeans, and you can look at many, many different products. I know I've showed students in the past coffee or chocolate. You saw the maps earlier on of Starbucks. It's hard to say anymore that one product is created solely in one place. And I would challenge you to try and find one of those products if we're not talking about like a made in the USA t-shirt. But it is really interesting how our world has become so interconnected. But also interesting how not everybody benefits at the same rate from this interconnection. I want you to take a look at this slide. I think it's pretty obvious that this is an anti-globalization slide with just images, and try and think about where I'm going here in terms of the pros and cons of globalization before I actually get there. Do the same for this slide. And again, you're just sort of previewing what I'm going to tell you and what I want you to get down in your notes. But this is pro-globalization. So I don't want to read these slides to you because I think that you're more than capable of reading through some of them, but I'm going to highlight a couple of the bullet points on each one of the slides in terms of advantages and disadvantages. So for this one of the clear advantages of globalization is this idea of increased free trade. This certainly is advantageous for the more developed countries. The other thing that I think is pretty significant in terms of advantages is the increased flow of communication, media, and data. Especially flow of communication is relevant when we're talking about the exchange of information between scientists, say, for example, who are working or trying to work on a cure to a certain disease. In some cases as well, you see greater ease and speed of transportation for goods and people. I still can't believe how easy it is for me to go online shopping and get products from all the way across the world delivered to my house in like 3 weeks. I know that this is true because my son really likes Pokemon, and I ordered him a whole bunch of little figures from China, and they came so quick I couldn't even believe it, like shipped from China. The other thing too that some would suggest as an advantage is as we become more interconnected, we begin to understand each other. So that leads to a reduction in cultural barriers with the hope of reduced likelihood of war between developed nations. One of the biggest disadvantages, and this is something that you hear often talked about in our own country, is the increased flow of manufacturing jobs from developed to developing nations. So this is commonly referred to as outsourcing, and you might hear people really complaining about the United States not making, quote unquote, making anything anymore here because our industry has changed. In addition, that you might see, I think that this is actually really relevant. We talked about this already, but when we talked about the 2008 economic recession, this is also a disadvantage of globalization because of the interconnectedness of our economies. If one nation doesn't do well, that tends to have an effect on all of the other nations who are part of this system. And though I previously said in the advantages slide that a reduction in cultural barriers would lead to hopefully a reduction in conflict, we haven't really seen that happening. And in fact, there's been a lot of conflict directed at the West as a result of or in reaction to globalization. And then the other thing that's a little bit scary is that when we're talking about interconnection, if there's a pandemic and a spread of worldwide disease because people are traveling from one place to the other daily, there's a greater risk of a pandemic occurring, but hopefully not the zombie kind. And then, probably what I believe is one of the more significant disadvantages is that sometimes you have countries like the United States locating to LDCs to get around environmental regulations, using developing nations' laxed environmental regulations to serve the corporations' need. Because being environmental can be somewhat expensive, it's easier for corporations to go where there aren't environmental regulations, so they don't have to put in place those environmental um, uh, processes to safeguard the environment, and rather you see, and as a result of this, what you see is an increase in pollution. Additional effects of globalization: 24-hour trade between major financial centers, thanks to those time zones. I'm not so sure that containerization is an effect or a reason why globalization is the way that it is. Just kind of a quick background story. Before containers were invented, people would ship or actually move product through something called break bulk shipping, which is literally like piece by piece, box by box, hay bale by hay bale, whatever it was. However, with the invention of containers or containerization, this is the reason why we have a thriving global marketplace that offers us a variety of things that we can buy. And it's also the reason why we can move cargo to remote parts of the world at a really minimal cost. And who would have thunk, all because a big giant shipping container was invented? We have the emergence of the global village. Again, kind of this world is not as big as it used to be. And the emergence of cultural conflict, this idea of globalization versus local diversity. Um, Look closely at some of the images and you might see what we're talking about. Especially, I find that upper left-hand video especially picture, not video, especially intriguing, because just look at the difference in the way the women are dressed. It is no surprise why there are some cultures out there that look at the West and think, no way. There's another form of conflict that I didn't really touch upon yet, but it's this idea of conflict between those countries that are profiting versus those countries that are not. Capitalism isn't working, or this idea of globalization not working. There's many different organizations out there that are protesting against the process with which we find ourselves. And as we move into the 21st century, this is what the world looks like now. And as a result of globalization, you really don't have any countries in the region of external area anymore, none of those green stripy countries, because really there really isn't any of those areas that exist anymore. There may be areas within countries that are untouched, some indigenous or tribal groups of people that still live without much technology or access. But really, there's not a single country anymore that you'll find in those external areas. Okay, guys, that's all. Tomorrow, when you come to class, be ready to take some notes on some maps. Not on some maps, using some maps. Well, we're going to look at some of the social, political, and economic characteristics of MDCs and LDCs. See y'all then.